A flaw of analytic philosophy and how to overcome it. This is an audio recording of an essay written for Substack. A few weeks ago I published an essay titled The End of Analytic Philosophy. In it I agreed with Liam Coffey-Bright that analytic philosophy has perhaps come close to becoming a degenerating research program, leaving even many of its practitioners with a pessimistic outlook on its future. But the post was not at all meant to be depressing, for I offered a successor paradigm, naturalistic philosophy. A philosophy with a strongly ambitious but continuous view of how philosophy can make progress using the tools of science. Now I was a bit worried about coming out as what I consider to be myself a non-analytic philosopher, since most of my peers happily use this label. I was therefore happy to see the overwhelming positive reactions that made my essay go somewhat viral on Substack and gain me a ton of new subscribers. However, this also brought with it a new bar for my writing, making me go from an experimental week where I posted daily to much less frequent posts recently. Now I had a good excuse since I was committed to several deadlines for writing projects I had to finish, but really I was afraid of failing to live up to the new bar I had set for my blog. This is really amusing, since blogging is usually seen as the kind of no-holds-barred, free-flowing, let your thoughts spill out on the page kind of activity. But just like with academic writing, it's easy to set oneself the goal of continuously surpassing one's previous writing, which can admittedly be very valuable. That is, unless it completely paralyzes one. Now, I hope you'll enjoy this essay. Similarly perhaps to my previous one if you've read it, because I want here to follow up on it, highlighting a central flaw of analytic philosophy. While some of my readers are fellow philosophers or have read enough philosophy to be sufficiently familiar with the methods and goals of analytic philosophy, many are not. To the layperson who has heard of the divide between analytic and continental philosophy, analytic philosophy may simply represent clear and rigorous argumentation, whereas continental philosophy is perhaps associated with obscurity, metaphors, and unclear, if any, arguments. So coming out against analytic philosophy could be easily read as being against clear writing, which is of course not what I'm against at all. Clear argumentation is very valuable. So reading my previous essay, I hope that you're not necessarily coming away with the conclusion that analytic philosophers don't just perhaps not draw sufficiently and have too little familiarity with what goes on in the sciences. While that is true, it is not sufficient reason for me to reject analytic philosophy or to distinguish naturalistic philosophy as a third kind of philosophy altogether, as I've done there. More conservatively, one might read this argument as amounting merely to a call for analytic philosophers to learn more about science, where it bears perhaps on the philosophical questions they're interested in. But the opposition between naturalistic philosophy and analytic philosophy runs deeper than that. There's a fundamental flaw in one of the central goals and methods of philosophy, namely the analysis of concepts. With the linguistic turn in the 20th century, philosophers became less concerned with the world and more concerned with language. How do we use concepts? How do we represent things in the world? How can sentences be true or false? What is the meaning of particular words? Analytic philosophy as a discipline moved away from its origins in natural philosophy that once combined philosophy and science and became closer to linguistics. Though surprisingly enough, without actually engaging all that much with linguists. Indeed, one might have expected the linguistic turn to lead to a different merger altogether, a merger between linguistics and philosophy. but only a few attempts to really make this happen, such as MIT's Joint Department of Linguistics and Philosophy. In many areas of analytic philosophy today, the central questions concern how we should define particular terms. In the philosophy of medicine, for instance, the central debate is about how we should understand terms like health, disease, pathology, and the like. How do analytic philosophers usually approach this problem? They do so by introspecting, by asking themselves about the intuitions they have concerning these concepts, and by trying to come up with a definition that comes as close as possible to providing necessary and sufficient conditions. It could help you distinguish boundary cases. Commonly, philosophers assert that these intuitions reflect not only how they themselves think about particular terms. Examples from other areas of philosophy include consciousness, knowledge, morality, but more generally, how competent language users in our society think about and use these terms. If this makes you raise an eyebrow, you aren't entirely unjustified. If we're interested in what the folk mean when they use a term, why should we consult the intuitions of one particular person, even if they're a great philosopher, rather than engage in the kind of research lexicographers and linguists are engaged in? This problem was recognized indeed by some analytic philosophers, and it led to the birth of what is now called experimental philosophy. Rather than taking for granted that some philosophers have privileged insights into how a concept should be understood, a method that is perhaps hopelessly unsuccessful, given that philosophers only rarely agree with one another in their literature, leading to endless debates justified by appeals to intuition, experimental philosophers draw on the tools of experimental psychology to probe the public on how they understand concepts. A central criticism by analytic philosophers of experimental philosophy has been that its psychological methods are flawed, since ordinary language users themselves poorly understand the proper conditions under which the terms are used. Instead, it is claimed this requires the expertise, perhaps, of a trained philosopher engaged in introspection. On the face of it, this criticism has some merit, yet one would expect analytic philosophers over time to at least approximate consensus then on the many questions concerning how particular terms should be understood. Largely the opposite is true, with philosophers continually trading in intuitions. Another criticism of experimental philosophy has been that it is not really philosophy at all. But this reflects an ambition present from the birth of analytic philosophy, the attempt to draw a sharp boundary between philosophy and the rest of intellectual inquiry. This ambition is precisely one of the reasons analytic philosophy has come close to becoming, indeed, a degenerating research program. Instead of distinguishing itself by its goals, philosophy attempted to distinguish itself by its methods. Yet even here this ambition failed. Scientists regularly reflect on how their terms should be defined, and even if philosophers think they do so poorly, they often do a better job than the philosophers criticizing them. After all, the goal of scientific concepts is not to capture folk intuitions, but to reflect progress in the sciences and aid further progress still, however unintuitive the resulting concepts may be. Consider, for instance, the really embarrassing criticisms of Dawkins' The Selfish Gene for using the term selfish incorrectly. Who cares? Language continuously evolves to help us communicate better with one another and to capture genuine patterns in reality that are worth communicating about. Analytic philosophers, however, argue and often give the mistaken impression that there's some single true meaning to terms like selfish or health, rather than recognizing them as polysemous concepts with multiple meanings that reflect the different purposes to which we put them to use. And further analysis simply will not resolve such conflicts. To dismay, perhaps, of analytic philosophers aiming for a precise language of clear argumentation, many of our terms are polysemous by design. Don't even get me started on the many ways in which Terms can be defined differently to serve the interests of particular political ideologies, such as freedom, equality, justice, and so on. To think that conceptual analysis could provide us here with a correct definition of these notions is unfortunately a chimera. Unfortunately, analytic philosophy stands at a fateful crossroads between two very different goals. If it takes the path of trying to understand the meaning of terms, it will be absorbed into psychology, linguistics, and lexicography, even if philosophers can continue to play useful roles within these fields. If analytic philosophy instead returns to the goal of trying to understand the world and our place within it, there's no alternative to naturalistic philosophy that sees itself as strongly continuous with the sciences. On such a naturalistic view, for example, our understanding of health should not consist in a mere analysis or even an experimental survey of what medical practitioners mean when they use the term health, even if this is confusingly how the term naturalism is often used within the philosophy of medicine. Rather, it involves identifying a real pattern in nature, shared by biological organisms that can play an important role in theorizing within the life sciences. Or so I've argued in my academic contributions to the philosophy of medicine. I've put some references below. Now obviously I favor the naturalistic route, but the alternative path leads to no less of a view of philosophy that is strongly continuous with science. The artificial separation of philosophy from other parts of inquiry serves no purpose other than to insulate ourselves from the very tools and methods that could help us to make progress on the philosophical questions we care most about. If you enjoyed reading this post or listening to it, please like, share and subscribe. It helps a lot to reach a wider audience. I'm interested also to read your thoughts in the comments, regardless of whether you disagree or agree with my points. I try to respond to all. Now I hope you enjoy your day.